Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SLF session on relational and restorative approaches to support positive behaviour. Could I just run through some protocols before we start the session? Please turn off your microphone as you come into the session and your camera. This session is being recorded and it will be available on the SLF portal up until the end of November, so unauthorised filming is not permitted. If you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat pane. However, it's much better if you can actually use the help function on the SLF portal for directly to Speakeasy, and they will be able to help you. If you lose connection, which happens to us all relatively regularly, please don't panic. Just use your original link and come back into the session. And we'd be very happy if you would like to tweet around the session, and could you use the hashtag SLF online, and that would be great. So we'll just go straight on to the session. We've got quite a full session today, so we'll need the full time. So my name is Janine McCulloch, and I work for Education Scotland in the Inclusion, Wellbeing, Equity and Equality team. And I'm joined today by Sue McLeod from North Ayrshire. Sue works in the Educational Psychology Department there, or service there. And we're also joined today by Dennis Hopkins, head teacher of St Bridget's School in North Ayrshire. We should be joined today by Heather McLean. Unfortunately, Heather will not be able to join us today, so I'm hoping that I can do Stirling Council's presentation justice and deliver it on Heather's behalf. So straight into the presentation. So you will all be aware the educational landscape in Scotland is quite complex. Between legislation, policies, priorities and guidance, it can get a cluttered landscape. However, there are real common principles that are interwoven across all Scottish related legislation and guidance and the articles of the UNCRC, and they're encapsulated here. All children have a right to an education. They have a right to get the support that they need and to benefit fully from their education and fulfil their potential. All children should be included, engaged and involved in their learning, and well-being, positive relationships and an inclusive ethos and culture are the foundation for learning. So in order to create these environments in all educational settings, there needs to be a shared understanding of inclusion, well-being, equality and equity that's underpinned by children's rights and how these factors affect relationships and behaviour. So, of course, this is some of the history behind how we approach relationships and positive behaviour within schools. And many of us will remember, it's within our lifetime of experiences, that this approach has changed drastically. It wasn't long ago when we included corporal punishment within schools, and that was actually only banned in the early, I think it was 1980, in state schools in Scotland. So we've come a long way since the early 1980s, when the cane and the belt would have been known in schools. But even over the last 20 years, the approach to behaviour and positive relationships in schools has significantly evolved. Previously, we would have moved from punitive discipline policies to what we currently focus on, which is building positive relationships and promoting pro-social behaviour and even teaching pro-social skills. So this shift in focus to relationship-based approaches has been embedded systematically into our curriculum delivery and our education-related policies and guidance, including those that promote attendance and participation and those that reduce the barriers to learning and exclusion. So this is something that all staff have a responsibility for, and they need to respond to the individual needs of learners and to promote and support their well-being and their readiness to learn. And these are some of the documents. The one on the right-hand side is our most up-to-date guidance towards our policies in this area. So it would be remiss of me not to set the current climate. And of course, in the last 2 years, we've seen significant changes. We've had COVID, but we've also had 2 major reviews, published reports, and that would be the one on the left-hand side at the top there, which was we commonly call it the Morgan Review, but the Additional Support for Learning Implementation Review. We've also had the culmination of 4 years of the Independent Care Review in the production of the Promise last March 2020. And since then, we've had the plan and the change programme. And of course, during that time, we've also had the incorporation of children's rights into Scottish law. So in all of these reviews, we have now taken the approach that we need to get the views of children and families. And these reviews very much tell us what they want and what they expect in education in our Scottish schools. They want their rights to be fully recognised and realised. They all want relationships to be prioritised. They want to be listened to and included, so never marginalised or stigmatised. They want school to be a safe space, to be supported in ways that meet their needs, and they want this support to be consistent from all the people who work with them. So it's not down to just a few members of the senior leadership team or pastoral or pupil support teams. So what are relational approaches? Because it's a broad term. Well, the diagram on the right shows you some of the approaches because that we have across Scottish schools. This is something that's evolved over time, but very much they are rights-based approaches. And one of the approaches that we will be most familiar with will be looking at schools through a nurture lens. Of course, we also have to consider how we care for our young people, and the Promise very much brought that out in that we have to remind ourselves that education is part of the scaffolding of care around children and families. We are a caring industry. Of course, we also need to look at some of our approaches, for example, the compassionate and connected communities, which many of you will have approached or are using within your local authorities or about to use within your local authorities. We have all the resources and support from the National Health Service, NES, their education service, through trauma-informed approaches, being trauma-sensitive and responsive. And of course, many schools will have practitioners who are trained in restorative approaches or solution-oriented language. So these are just some of the relational approaches we have. All of them complement each other. And none of them are at odds with each other. So why do we need to keep refocusing on relationships? Because we've had guidance, we've had professional learning. So it's just to remember some of the underpinning principles to all the legislation and guidance. Relationships are part of that legislation. It's part of GTCS standards, the SSSC standards and the CLD standards. And an inclusive ethos and culture are the foundations for learning, and it is the basis, it's the cornerstone of education within Scotland. And also one further reminder, and that's why we need to keep refocusing on relationships, is that children and young people have told us they want support to be consistent from the people who work with them. And when you take a relationship-based approach, it's more difficult to get this consistency across staff groups. So I very, very briefly just want to go into how we used to view relationships and behaviour within school from a behaviour management point of view through to what we use today, which is that relational approach and all those approaches that we showed in that little diagram a few slides ago. So behaviour management approaches were very much rules-based, and if a rule was broken, you had a sanction. So when we were approaching it, the mindset would be, what has happened? What rule has been broken? They're very reactive, and you could, in fact, get a completely consistent response to that system, because everybody knew if that rule was broken, this is what the response is going to be. So it was very easy to gain that consistency across adults. It was very easy to see. But It is not responsive to individual needs, and it would not take into account the differences between youngsters. And we very much know now that we have to act in the best interests of the child. Now, with the UNCRC and Article 3, different children have different needs, so we need to respond differently. Of course, a relational approach is quite different. It is based on high expectations, it's values driven, and those expectations and values need to be shared across the staff group. And there is one of the places where that we can struggle to get consistency. It is very much proactive and preventative, and we have to emphasize here, it is the consistency of approach, not response. And that is where it is difficult to get that consistency. But it is responsive to individual need. So in a restorative mindset, we would be asking, what's the story? What's the story behind what's happened? Who's been affected and how? So what's been the impact or the harm caused? What needs to happen to put things right? What's the solution? And how can we support this process to be able to change behaviour, to deter others, or to avoid a reoccurrence of this situation happening again? So it's very much, for that to happen, it's very much relationships focused and not process driven. So to support this, we have coming soon. They are not just published just yet, but we will be producing some new resources. On the left-hand side here, we'll be producing a document that is very much at an informed level. We are following the approach that NES have been approaching around mental health supports and around trauma-informed practice, where we're going to be delivering our resources either at an informed level or a skilled level or enhanced level or a specialist level. So this resource is very much geared for every single practitioner to use in their classroom, how they interact with children around the school. It is not the skilled response. This will be produced soon, and we'll have lots of links through to all the different relational approaches, including restorative approaches, which will be a separate resource that we are producing, which will include little modules, which I'll show you in just a moment, little professional learning modules that people could run through themselves or through small groups of staff or as whole staff training. And we are taking this approach across all of Education Scotland. So, for example, some of the modules in the restorative approaches document were yesterday launched and introduced through the professional learning framework that was introduced for pupil support assistance in SLF just yesterday morning. So this is just a little taster of what it will look like and what the little modules will look like. They are designed to take just maybe 10 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on whether you're having professional dialogue with others or if it's part of an in-service training, and some supporting material, which is really, really brief. So it should be accessible to everyone. And so, for example, for restorative approaches, we're very much looking at values and the thinking and the language behind restorative approaches, how to conduct informal restorative conversations with pupils, and maybe moving on to using circles for teaching, for problem solving. So not after an incident, but at that sort of more universal level. So restorative approaches we're going to look at in a little bit more detail, and this is where you have to forgive me because I am now going to take on the persona of Heather McLean. Hopefully she's able to listen to this, to say how Stirling Council have been implementing restorative approaches in Stirling Council. Well, Stirling Council have an underpinning approach of nurture behind everything that they do, but after they looked at the previous guidance and reviewed that and updated their sort of central focus around relationships, they realised that they wanted to do a little bit more. So give staff within schools a little bit more support in terms of how to use positive relationships and promote positive behaviour within schools. So hence they decided to go down the route of implementing restorative approaches. This is very much how Stirling Council see all of their approaches that fit together. So restorative approaches were never designed to be standalone. It was to fit around their relationships at the centre, but to fit into their culture and ethos, their solution-oriented approaches and language that they used when they use trauma-sensitive and responsive approaches within schools. They would interlink with their NME programme, their neurosequential model for education, their peer support programmes, and it would be rights-based. But it would also interact with when you needed more support in terms of the targeted support that they would provide and their stage intervention model. So it was very much from the ground up when they started to train staff, it was going to be an integral part of all of these systems. Of course, I already said that Stirling Council have nurture right at the heart of everything that they do. So they used very much the whole school approach and the self-evaluation framework right from the outset of restorative approaches. And very much they were focusing in around one of the nurture principles, which was all behaviours communication. And saying restorative approaches is a useful approach whenever you're needing to address this nurture principle within your schools. So how did they do it? Well, they had, right from the outset, they looked at their implementation model. So they saw the end in mind, but they said, how are we going to get there? And so very much it was exploring where they were currently within Stirling. And I know that they had a lot of staff, individual members of staff, who had previously received training around restorative approaches, but it wasn't consistent across all schools and it wasn't readily available across all schools. And certainly most schools did not have a programme around restorative approaches. So it would have come down to individuals who had previously been trained. Or if they had previously started a whole school programme, the trainer had maybe moved on. So they decided it was time to start afresh and look across the whole local authority at doing an authority-wide training. So that was the installation part of it and the initial implementation. So they're still in this initial implementation and moving towards full operation. I think they would have been in the full operation stage by this stage if we hadn't have had COVID over the last 2 years. So moving on to where they have been. They looked at their existing good practice because restorative approaches had successfully been introduced into some of their schools. From there, they decided, what do we need to be able to introduce this across all of our schools? So they got a group of 24 facilitators and they established that group, and that included 2 teachers from each of their learning communities and a raft of professionals from their centre within the local authority. They provided, provided initial professional learning for the facilitators, and that was 2 days initially training for those 24 facilitators, and then with a follow-up training day a year later, and we're just about to go back and top that up again. They then, very much, those 24 facilitators got together and looked at how they were going to roll this out into their schools. They now had trained facilitators. How were they going to take it out in the schools, knowing that they couldn't do it in full-day training courses, but it needed to be bite-sized. So they developed a process for sharing with establishments. And prior to COVID, they had already 2 secondary schools and 12 primary schools and 5 early years establishments had already begun to implement the model. So they have already, as I said, we went back a year later and they said to us, we need a little bit more support around additional support needs and our very young learners. And that's, we did some collaborative learning together on that follow-up day for the professional learning. And we're about to go back and look at universal supports that are restorative and also circles. We'll be doing that next week. So right the way through, they recognised they wanted to be dynamic, so they were going to reflect and adapt the process as they went forward, and they found that because of COVID, that's what they've had to do. So, embedding restorative approaches, a whole school, a whole establishment approach. What they did was they looked at their local facilitator, looked at their learning community and considered that readiness to take on board restorative approaches where are they in their professional learning journey. They asked staff to reflect on where they were, and they provided initial professional learning to try and establish, as we said right at the beginning there, that shared understanding, which is absolutely key to success of any relational approach. All staff need to agree to the approach and be using it all of the time to develop that trust in the process with the young people and parents. So they had their implementation group established, they had their plan, and they started to share with their learning communities. They also looked right from the outset what data would help them support, telling them if it was having an impact and if it was being successfully rolled out, and that was part of their implementation plan. They have provided ongoing professional learning from their educational psychology team, but also from the people within the centre who were part of that initial 24 facilitators, who weren't all from the educational psychology service. Some were from pupil support type services, youth services, etc. And what they want to happen as they go forward using their supportive activities, they want it to just become part of what you do every day. I think they feel that nurture is part of what they do every day, and they want restorative approaches to be the same. So what has changed? These are some of the quotes that have come from the practitioners within the schools and early learning centres that have started to use restorative approaches. And I'll just pick out of a few. Restorative conversations have strengthened and helped to build positive relationships within the nursery. The learner responds well when his voice is respected and listened to, and he's able to understand others' points of view. So these are some of the things that the practitioners are saying themselves. But without me not having to read some of these things, some of them can actually tell you themselves. So I'm hoping somebody will tell me if this actually has sound.
Hi, my name is Emma and I'm an early childhood educator at Lynn Nursery.
It's got sound names, quite echoey.
And have definitely been the slave of our room from, you know, the calmer, peaceful environment. So children are finding ways that they can resolve conflict and restoratively approach situations for themselves. We really pride ourselves here at Lynn in our nurture approaches. So basically though, using restorative approaches has really helped us to enhance our nurturing approach and to really embed the nurture principles within our practice, particularly all behaviour is communication. One of the challenges we have found with using the restorative approach is that, you know, within the room, if we're working with a child and working through the restorative approach together, it needs to be a whole staff supported thing. So staff need to support each other within doing that. We found that, you know, it's giving the child the right amount of time to think about and reason with what has happened, but also making sure that, you know, in a busy playroom that there is, you know, enough staff to support you doing that whilst all these other things are going on as well.
Hi, I'm Laura Watt, Senior Early Childhood Educator at Lynn Nursery. Here at Lynn Nursery, we use restorative approaches when working with children. We've introduced the approach of using the Fix It folder, which has visuals that help children be able to communicate their feelings, and this supports lots of children. We're all able to use a consistent approach, and all staff are doing the same thing, which helps children feel safe and secure within the nursery. They know what's happening, they know the expectations. So one of the challenges that we have had in the nursery is that we have had a few new staff starting within the nursery. So we have to constantly think about training people and keeping everybody up to date, and so that everybody's got the same knowledge and understanding about the approach that we're using.
Hi, my name is Anne-Cara Jones and I teach P7 at Lynn Primary School. We use restorative approaches throughout the school. It's part of our culture in the school, and the children are very used to us having restorative conversations with them. So some of the ways in which I use restorative conversations or restorative practice is I'm always modelling it for them. So when the children come in, it's embedded in the routine. So when they come in, just always check in with each of them, ask them how they're feeling on the 5-point scale. I'll also regularly talk to them in a restorative way. So if I can see someone's off task, I'll try and say, oh, what can I do to help you get on task at the moment? I'll try and reflect their feelings back to them if I can see they're getting a little frustrated, a little distracted, or maybe they're feeling a bit down.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Matthew Harding and I am Deputy Head at Fulham Primary School. I think some of the challenges that we have seen when implementing restorative practices, first of all, is the time. So I suppose it can take up some more time rather than just, dishing out the usual punishment. Instead, we're taking that time to fix and repair the relationship between whoever's involved. And again, I suppose that can take more time to sit down and listen and hear both sides of the story. However, though, I do think there are positives that come from that. The children start to learn that this is how we deal with conflict, or we deal with issues in the school. And again, they begin to start to go into these conversations automatically and start talking about how they're feeling and how that person made them feel. And what they're going to do to make that situation better. So one of the other biggest challenges that we've looked at or talked about, or we've seen in our school context, is getting the information out there to the parents to understand, this is the approach that we're now taking in the school. Obviously, this has been hindered with the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's something that we're working towards as we move forward. Looking at more video solutions, looking at possibility of showing what a restorative conversation looks like online, and sharing what we can through via video at the moment while we're still in our COVID-19 situation. So getting children to understand and reflect on how they're feeling and how others are feeling will greatly it has greatly benefited our school and the community.
So that was great to hear how the early implementation of restorative approaches were happening in Stirling Council, and they very much highlighted that it's a work in progress, and that they have encountered challenges, but all the time they're thinking dynamically as to how they go forward. So we actually are, and this is their next steps, we are delivering some professional learning next week, because just like the last time, they realised they needed a little bit more support around youngsters with additional support needs or very young youngsters. This time they've said we want to look at restorative approaches on a more universal level, and also how can we use it in the classroom for restorative circles. So that's what we'll be doing next week. They are very much looking at that implementation model and how they deliver professional learning actually within the schools, that format, and also as a targeted support approach. They're looking to continue to focus on the whole school or whole establishment approach to actually support restorative circles potentially going forward, sharing with parents and communities through a film, and develop a framework to build restorative skills within the curriculum and share the approach with the young people. So you heard them talking about the Fix It folder, and which gives visuals that the youngsters can go through a restorative conversation between themselves. So developing that type of thing further. So Heather has actually kindly given us her email address, and she's very happy for you to approach her to ask her any questions about Stirling Council and their approach. I'm now going to pass over to Sue McLeod, who, as I mentioned before, is in North Ayrshire, and North Ayrshire are quite a number of years further down the line of introducing restorative approaches. So she will tell you about their journey.
Thanks, Nadine. So I'm going to tell you a bit about North Ayrshire's approach to promoting positive relationships, and that includes how we have incorporated nurture and restorative approaches within that. And then you're going to hear from one of our very esteemed head teachers, Dennis Hopkins, who will tell us about his journey. Next slide, please. Okay, so promoting positive relationships within North Ayrshire, it has been a long journey for us. We feel that we've come quite a long way. I suppose we started by ripping up our existing behaviour policy all those years ago and creating our new promoting positive relationships policy. It was written to help our educational establishments further embed and strengthen a nurturing North Ayrshire approach, which was, well, we like to think is very well embedded within the authority at the moment. The policy follows national guidance that all local authorities should have a relationships policy, which should then inform individual school policy. And I feel that we have come quite a long way with that journey. So significant progress has been made in developing our nurture culture and ethos within all of our establishments, and the policy will further support consistency. I know Stirling was talking about consistency, Janine's been talking about consistency. It really is so important, and really developing that whole systems approach. So the policy really acknowledges that for many of our children and young people, a traditional behaviourist approach is not appropriate, and it sets out an alternative model which focuses on relationships. The context of in North Ayrshire is a nurturing base, but we've got restorative approaches within that. Next slide, please, Janine. So our policymakers in schools have ensured that the nurturing approach underpins all of their work, and that staff at all levels have a clear and shared understanding of what a nurturing approach means in practice. So school improvement plans are grounded in the work of nurture and positive relationships, and senior leaders work with school staff, parents, pupils and partners to ensure that school systems such as the use of rewards and consequences are not seen as the go-to approach, and rather that there's a clear focus on the well-being and the rights of children and young people at the heart. So currently we have whole school nurture. So every establishment within North Ayrshire has had continuing lifelong professional learning in nurture, including all the nurture principles and the application of nurture principles. And we also have targeted nurture within our classes in our mainstream primaries, secondaries and all our early year settings and all our specialist provision. But within that, we are using restorative approaches across the authority to support the nurture principles. And Stirling were talking about all behaviour is communication, and yes, they're absolutely very relevant within that context, but we are now sort of working towards looking at language as a vital means of communication, and I'll talk about a bit more about that. Next slide, please, Janine. Okay, so really our journey from around 2015, all our primary and secondary schools had senior management teams representative on 2.5-day training, which was delivered by Education Scotland and us, our psychological service. Following on from that, all the clusters have had additional input, with senior managers leading further rollout of training for all staff. We've also done additional professional learning for all our campus COPs. But as I said before, our emphasis now is changed slightly, and we are, rather than expecting schools to think about implementing a model where there are formal meetings around restorative, we've kind of stripped back and looking at language now, and the language of trauma informed, the emphasis being on language within everyday conversations, and the emphasis on skills such as listening and attunement and responding in a paceful way, which has been, paceful approaches are developed from Dan Hughes, DDP, and it's about being playful, accepting, curious and empathetic. So the restorative conversation can be conducted at any time using a simple set of questions, which things like what's happened, how's this affected you, what needs to happen now to move forward. And this type of approach can often resolve any conflict by responding to the needs of both parties without necessarily having to go to a full meeting. So it's like early intervention, if you like, around restorative approaches and just thinking about the language used. This is a very busy slide, but it's just an example of how you might want to think about using a script. Some people use scripts until sort of language is embedded and becomes more automatic. So, for example, when we're thinking about what happened, we're starting a restorative conversation, we might want to acknowledge and we might want to accept. We can hear and see that you're really upset by this, for example. Can't imagine how that must feel for you, but I will try. You're trying to put yourself in others' shoes. And sometimes for children and young people, just getting that feeling that you are just trying to get them, you're just trying to understand. You might not have all the answers, but you're just trying to get how they're feeling. That can sometimes go a long way in making them feel safe and listened to and heard. And moving on, what were your thoughts at the time? Which is a typical restorative approaches question. You can build on that by, can you help me understand how you felt at the time? Can you say a bit more about that? You can be a bit more specific and talking about feelings. Sometimes this can be a corridor conversation, doesn't have to be something that's well planned in advance. It can become very automatic in everyday situations and conversations. Next slide, please, Janine. We try and evaluate our whole school nurture approaches, and restorative is very much within that. This is just an example of one of the questions that go out in our annual survey. What systems are in place to manage behaviour, relationships and transitions in your establishment? And you can see there that restorative approaches has come out top in the most used approach, which we're very pleased about because we have put an awful lot of work into that. But the majority of the responses there are in line with the messages that are given out in our promoting positive relationships policy. So we're very, very pleased with that. Next slide, please. This is just a few examples of some of the qualitative feedback that we've had about the benefits and impact of restorative approaches. And all the comments are around relationships, about impact on resolving class conflict. This is quotes too from Campus Cops, an excellent way of dealing with conflict in the school, giving all parties a voice. And restorative approaches are having a positive effect on relationships. So we're hitting all the right notes there, hopefully. Next slide, please. There are obviously challenges, but the overarching feeling of what makes it work is about staff. It's about staff commitment. It's about belief, values, ethos. It fits with our nurturing ethos. It fits with and supported by authority directives. It's a very much a top-down and bottom-up approach, and hopefully we're meeting in the middle there as well with practitioners and what we see on the ground every day and the language that we hear. And as Stirling have said as well, the main challenge and barrier has been time. It's very hard and it takes a lot of skill to prepare young people to take part in very formal meetings. So that's why we have changed our tack a bit, and we are talking about trauma-informed language, paceful language, solution-oriented language, restorative language. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't mean that you have to have set scripts, but there's a lot of frameworks out there that all fit together. They're not all separate initiatives. They can all come together and work towards that common goal of promoting positive relationships, which we all know leads on to higher attainment. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to pass over to Dennis, who is going to tell us a little bit about his journey at St Bridget's Primary School.
Hi there, folks. I know we're quite tight for time, so I will speak quite quickly to try and squeeze in what I want to say. So, St Bridget's Primary School, it's in Kilburnie. 4/5 of my children are SIMD 1 or 2. We have almost 50% free school meals. I do believe it's higher than that because I don't think my P1, 2 and 3 parents actually claim. So you can imagine the area we are in. And I think probably the one big claim we always made at St Bridget's was that you could lift this building and place it anywhere in Scotland and you wouldn't know. And I think Nurture came at exactly the right time for us. As a school, I had recently been appointed to a school that had the same head teacher and staff for the best part of 20 odd years, and it came at exactly the right time. If I get cut off, Nurture works, 100%, end of discussion. I know for a fact, because I live it, breathe it, we all now do within St Bridget's, and it works. And there's no other part of my job where I can confidently stand up and say, 100% success rate, but I would say that about every one child who has attended my nurture class. So we were very fortunate. We were one of the early schools given the opportunity through the Attainment Challenge to have a nurture class. We very quickly get into the swing of things, got it up and going, and we saw very quick success with our targeted children. Afternoon sessions were more flexible, working with larger groups, working with targeted groups throughout the whole of the school, whereas the morning was primary 1, 2 and 3. Children getting 1 term, 2 terms, 3 terms, 4 terms, even a sneaky 5 terms sometimes. Don't tell Sue, she might get me sacked. But we had genuine success, loved it to bits. Very, very full uptake. And it's funny because amongst everything else that goes on within our school, Nurture has been consistent, and it's growing by the day because everyone is seeing how it works. And we've been so well supported by North Ayrshire through a very rigorous and robust training programme. So myself and another member of the SMT went to initial training, come back raving about it, encouraged a couple of staff members to join. They then went back for their training. And North Ayrshire has so much materials to support us along the lines of the key values of Nurture, as you know, reconnection, sense of safety, developing a proper curriculum that looks at play, movement, regulation, looking at transition and so on. And that training material was there for us all the time, and we've got access to that. And then we brought in seven units that we can access. And I think Sue mentioned it very briefly, but we do it as a hufty. We call it a hufty because we all do it. Everyone tackles 7 units, and we can provide that to you, I'm sure. Sue, I'm sure we can share that out to anybody who wishes it. And we have these modules that the staff can work as a whole team. I'm watching my clock. I'm sorry for speaking so quickly. So I want to really stress, I really want to stress that in a school like mine, and I'm sure a lot of you work in schools in situations very similar to mine, in a school like mine, it works. Simple as that. It works in my school. It works in my early years. I have an ESR supported base here too, and it works in there too. And it's crucial that we take it on board. And a lady, if you don't mind me quoting you, a lady called Lynn Alexander asked a question about how do you get all staff on board. Well, that last bit of my slide about patting the head, on my first staff chat, and my first full staff meeting when I got the job here, a lady in the staff said to me, you know, this won't work in Kilburnie, this high-fiving, this patting them on the head as they go by. She told me it wouldn't work. 2 years later, she was my nurture teacher, running my nurture class amazingly well. It works. And Lynn, I would say, Lynn, that no matter how much reticence there is amongst the staff, just get stuck in about it, it drip feeds. And if you can convince the pat in the head lady to then lead your nurture class, you can do it. Stick with it. It definitely works. We know it works. Google it. It works. I stuck to my time.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you. I hope that everybody's getting a flavour of how passionate we feel about this, because we are very passionate about positive relationships, and I hope that's coming across. Thanks, Dennis. Just to say that we are continuing to embed the idea of language as being a vital means of communication. And we are going to be offering bespoke restorative approaches professional learning with consideration of our neurodiverse learners, and we're trying to be very creative and learning, you know, using visuals and cartoons, etc. I'm going to very quickly pass you back to Janine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue and Dennis. That was excellent. And if you're not convinced already to be looking more closely into restorative approaches, hopefully you are now. This was just a slide to say thank you to Heather, who produced that wonderful presentation, and it's a shame that she wasn't able to deliver it herself, Sue and Dennis from North Ayrshire, and also to remind you that we will have resources coming out in the National Improvement Hub shortly to support what we've talked about today, to say, see all your relational approaches together. None of them are wrong, none of them are better than the others. They complement each other, they're a sliding scale, and so what you introduce within your local authority will work as long as you get consistency across your staff group. And we're hoping that these resources will support you with that, along with other resources on the National Improvement Hub. So please look out for them. We will advertise them through Scotland Learns and our other means. And thank you for attending this webinar today. We hope that you've learned something. And I can't believe it, but we have finished on time.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
I'll leave this slide up just for a few moments, just so people can take down our email addresses if you so wish.